wanted to do another book here on World War One. This time, Professor Neil Ferguson's Pity of War. And the reason why I got into this book, it's kind of random, but I just saw him on BBC talking about World War One with a bunch of other professors in the audience. And I thought some of his arguments were really interesting, arguments that I've never heard before. So I decided to pick up the book, read through it, and make a video. Now, it's not the easiest book to read. It's incredibly detailed. If you don't like your academic books, you're not going to like it. It's a very small book. Its font is incredibly small, which is very frustrating in my opinion. And it's got a lot to go through, particularly if you're looking to learn some of the details about the war and some of the details related to many of the important actors involved. It's just incredible how much detail is involved, and I like making notes when I read books. This book took me a very long time and included a lot of notes. So, with that being said, you may or may not be interested in it, but that's fine. I think it's worthwhile read. I think it's got a lot of interesting arguments and a lot of, interesting details that I've never heard before. I really liked his antithetical approach to Britain, to some of the British strategy, I guess, in the war. He makes a fairly solid case that essentially British strategy fighting in France was pretty brutal for the most part. Their tactics pretty brutal. The Allies generally pretty brutal. Of course, he goes through British policy and why wasn't, the British Empire was so powerful? Why didn't it overtake the Central Powers with ease or relative ease or end the war sooner? So a lot of detail, a lot of arguments, a lot of discussion to go through. And for this particular book and reviewing it, I'm actually not going to be able to go through all those details at this point in time, which is, in my opinion, a good thing because this would be like a 2-hour video. So I'm going to go hopefully over some of the general outlines of the book, give you some background that you may want to consider or review before getting into the book. And then, of course, a little bit later on, I shouldn't say of course, but hopefully I can go into some of the details of parts of the book and provide some later videos in that respect. So that being said, I just wanted to provide sort of a snapshot of just, I guess, more of a background of some of the important points heading into World War One, and this acts as a nice background to the book itself. So I'm just adding a few additional points via Margaret Macmillan's lecture on her book, The War That Ended Peace, and of course the book itself, which again I recommend people take a look at. So the first point I wanted to add here is that the idea of globalization, the first stage of globalization, was really reaching its peak before 1914 in the outbreak of World War I. So I've got a map here of the 1901 undersea telegraph cabling. So you can see here that, of course, people are becoming more and more connected, and this is allowing data and communications to travel further, faster, and to more people. So it's similar, I guess, to the early version of the internet. And another sort of example I wanted to give you here on globalization is the actual boat routes or boating routes through the North Pacific and the South Pacific. And all the green lines indicate shipping routes. Now, it's probably a lot more shipping and a lot more shipping routes nowadays, but you can see here that North Pacific and South Pacific are just scattered with lines and, I'm sure boats and goods being traveled from Japan, America, South America, all over the place. So not only are you having the increase in communication and the ability to reach more and more people, but of course goods are being shipped further to more people as well. Now, it's often argued that, or at least I should say, it has been argued that increasing globalization is a good thing and it actually acts as a deterrent of some sort against war. So in other words, when people are trading with each other more so, then they don't really have much of an interest in going to war because they're both benefiting. There's sort of this mutual benefit. However, you have to remember that in 1914, Britain and Germany were each other's largest trading partners, and they nonetheless went to war. And of course, World War I transpired and caused a lot of damage. So, globalization isn't a check on war, it can actually act as an impetus to war itself. And we can actually see that nowadays because have been arguing that the US and China are actually destined to war. Now, that's not necessarily because of an increase in globalization. That's likely much more to do with Thucydides' trap. And Thucydides' trap applies to, of course, Germany and Britain in World War I. But nonetheless, the point is that globalization did not prevent or necessarily prevent World War I from happening. The point here on the 1914 status of colonies between the British Empire and Germany. Germany was an up and coming power before World War I, and many had seen the growth of Germany as a threat to the status quo, not only in international relations, but just in terms of its raw, particular economic, social, and even military power. And you can see here that in the blue, the Germans, they have some land in Africa, they have some land in the South Pacific, number of islands. They have Tsingtao in China. I believe they're in a handful of other places as well. Germany was looking in Southeast Europe and other parts around the world, particularly in the Middle East with the Baghdad rail network, to expand its influence through its colonies, through its economic power, through its sort of up and coming status. Now, some people didn't see this necessarily as a direct threat, and we've seen many of these arguments play out time and time again in a number of different circumstances. But you can see that not only was Germany growing, but the importance of colonies to just international clout. France, of course, had a number of colonies. Great Britain, or the British Empire rather, of course, all the way from northern Canada to southern New Zealand, immense amount of wealth, particularly financial and naval power. And so it's good to get sort of a snapshot of what's going on in terms of colonies, international relations before World War I. I'd also like to note here, and I know this is, I wouldn't say common knowledge, but this is well known within the study of World War I, that wars were becoming more and more defensive. And starting with roughly somewhere around the American Civil War, if not the American Civil War itself, moving forward, technology was really forcing armies to essentially stand off and utilize trenches, utilize more defensive tactics. And of course, all the way into World War I, you have machine gun nests, and you have charges into machine gun nests. You have artillery just pounding away at ours. Inability of any real movement or significant movement along lines. World War I really encapsulated sort of the defensive nature, strategy, tactics of war, but this wasn't necessarily anything new. This was the trend. Another point here that I'd like to note is, I know this is somewhat of a funny picture and it shows a number of different relations. Of course, we have Germany and British relations here. Now, this is somewhat unique in some respects to, our history isn't often thought of this anymore, but back then, alliances, particularly in the 19th century leading up to about World War I, alliances were constantly shifting and often included many sort of intricate social relations between different countries and different nations. And so, before World War I, we all know, okay, France, Britain, Russia, okay, great, they're all aligned. But the British didn't actually state explicitly or note in terms of public policy that they were aligned and ready to go to war against Russia with France and go to war against Germany with France and Russia, rather. In fact, there was significant talk, and some have argued that it was entirely possible that Germany and Great Britain, or the British Empire rather, would have actually formed an alliance, and that would have totally changed, in terms of counterfactuals, the entire history of the early 20th century moving forward. So it's one of those what ifs, and I know it's hard to go into those with any detail or certainty, but it's a good thing to remember because alliances had been shifting and being remade all throughout the 19th century. The Pity of War, the book itself, goes over 10 specific questions, and I'll just quickly go through them and just try to just provide a brief review of some of the questions here. So the first question is, was the war inevitable, whether because of militarism, imperialism, secret diplomacy, or the arms race? And number 2, why did Germany's leaders gamble on war in 1914? Number 3, why did Britain's leaders decide to intervene when war broke out on the continent? And number 4, was the war as is often asserted, really greeted with popular enthusiasm? Number 4 really strikes me for a number of different reasons. First, Professor Ferguson has a number of different details, or provides just a great insight in terms of how people are feeling and different communities within different countries are feeling. You can imagine if you're a French teacher in a school near the front, how you feel about hearing, shells blowing up in the distance, or your government essentially telling you guys, you gotta bail because the Germans are coming. I'm sure they weren't that enthusiastic and ready to go to war. I'm pretty sure they were pretty, fairly scared, if not completely terrified. And so once you begin to see the other side, or the other sides, vis-a-vis this idea of popular enthusiasm, you kind of get a picture that not only were many people not enthusiastic, but many people viewed the war in a not so heroic, sort of prideful kind of light. Number 5, did propaganda and especially the press keep the war going as Karl Kraus believed? I'll just answer that quickly. No. But it's great to see some of the iconic pictures that he provides in the book. And it's also great to just get an idea of, how the government was trying to push people to war and, war production, and try to utilize propaganda in a relatively early age of, I guess you could say, marketing. Number 6, why did the huge economic superiority of the British Empire not suffice to inflict defeat on the Central Powers more quickly and without American intervention? This is probably the most important question in the book, if not the second most important question. And it almost boggles my mind how the Central Powers, and specifically Germany, was able to continue fighting the war for so long. John Maynard Keynes believed that the war would be over within a year, within 2 years. He kept on revising his estimates because he among many other economists believed that the war would be too expensive, and not only would Austro-Hungarian Empire rather, and Germany essentially bail on war because they couldn't afford it, but also the British, they simply couldn't afford it. But it's interesting to see that even by 1918, with the German Spring Offensive, the Germans were still able to fight even more effectively than the British and French on the Western Front. Number 7, why did the military superiority of the German army fail to deliver victory over the British and French armies on the Western Front, as it had delivered over Serbia, Romania, and Russia? I really like this question, and it's so just absolutely nuts to read about what happened to Russia in just all over the front line, behind the front line. It's just a complete mess in some respects. Russia Of course, bailed in 1917 with the Second October Revolution, and a lot of the story about Russia bailing, of course, is and the revolution is, you know, it's just very detailed. There's a lot of actors involved and what have you, but there's some real simple pictures that are provided within Professor Ferguson's book that tell you, man, like no wonder the Russians essentially revolted and basically threw over their governments. Many Russian soldiers, they would go to they'd go to war barefoot. They wouldn't have any shoes, socks, proper clothing in some circumstances. And in Laura Engelstein's Russia in Flames, she details that a lot of Russian soldiers didn't even have guns. So they would, they'd be in a platoon or a relatively small team, and they'd wait for the guy with the gun to die, and then they'd go pick up the gun, fire some rounds, then they would die, and then the next guy would come, pick up the gun. It was just absolutely nuts. So, whenever I read those stories or think about those stories, I think, well, no wonder Russia was like completely destroyed. But you also have to remember that the Germans were really scared prior to 1914. There's a real sense of unease within parts of the German government that because Russia was growing so rapidly economically, that it would actually be able to seriously challenge the Germans if war ever broke out within the next decade or whatever. So there was an idea that the Germans should attack the Russians and crush them before the opposite happens. Number 8, why did men keep fighting when, as the war poets tell us, conditions on the battlefield were so wretched? I really like this question too. This is probably my favorite question in the entire book. My image of World War One is essentially everybody has trench foot, mud is everywhere, water is everywhere, explosions in the background, foreground, and you're extremely lucky to be alive. Totally fair. That is definitely an image of World War One. However, you have to think like, okay, so how did these guys continue on fighting? Like that just seems absolutely maddening. No sleep, like it's just nuts. But the reality is that many men had time off the line. Australians were able to basically go back and horse race. The Canadians were able to get off the front line, play baseball. Some men were able to go back home and take a break, and many of the men, particularly the British, would say nobody back home would understand anything about the war. The media was just essentially telling them nonsense. So there's a lot involved here, and the idea of, okay, why would this guy go fight? It just baffled me because I just can't rationalize it, but it's really interesting. Number 9, why did men stop fighting? And number 10, who won the peace? Or to be precise, who ended up paying for the war? Number 10, of course, Hall of Mirrors. I personally think the war was just absolutely stupid and got out of hand out of virtually all the policymakers. What was supposed to happen or what should have happened among many quote unquote experts never did happen. I from my understanding, very, very few men and or policymakers were looking for or were expecting a drawn out war. And the drawn out war had its consequences, of course, the Russian Revolution, but there was the German Revolution, there was ultimately the Treaty of Versailles, and then the consequences thereafter. And so some of these questions, they're again very detailed and difficult to sort of parse and go through in terms of a video rather. But I'm hoping to come back to some of these questions and provide some more detail and hopefully provide an avenue for discussion on some of this. So thanks for your time, everyone, and hope to hear from you. Thanks.